at that time, what was that campaign?
So essentially the campaign was to say, for the period of the pandemic, intellectual property on these products should be suspended. Right? So we should suspend so intellectual property law became as strong as it is today in the mid-90s, where a bunch of corporations, including pharma corporations, went to the newly formed WTO and they thought, this is great, this is something really enforceable. And they put intellectual property in there as one of the primary objectives of the WTO. It's in one of the first agreements signed called the TRIPS agreement. And what this basically said was every country in the world has to adopt US-style intellectual property laws, right? So minimum 20 years monopoly on inventions that you own. And let's be honest, it often goes way beyond 20 years because of the way that they make tiny changes and then renew their monopoly. But this was massive. This was massive because up to that point, very few countries in the world put intellectual property on medicines. It was not really considered the done thing. I mean, even in Western Europe up to the late 70s, this was not the done thing. And it meant that you undercut, and this doesn't just apply to medicines, by the way. I mean, if you actually look at how countries that did very well in the 60s, 70s, and 80s developed, they did it by trading with countries, learning the technologies that they used, and copying them.
Yeah.
That's how South Korea went from being a very poor country to a very rich country in a generation. It's how China developed. And then suddenly there was this law saying, no, you can't do this. You must not do this. This is theft. And it massively changed power dynamics in the world. And we think this is just a problem, right? It shouldn't exist at all. But at the very least, in the middle of a pandemic, it should not be used as an obstruction to the production of the number of vaccines that we actually need. Because what it was doing, it wasn't simply that we weren't donating any vaccines to the global south.
Almost gatekeeping.
Yeah, absolutely. It was like not that we weren't selling any. It was that we were literally stopping them producing their own. Right? There was productive capacity around the world to produce this stuff in the quantities that we needed it, and we refused to allow it.
What I find crazy about also this COVID situation is, and we talked about it when you guys had your talk, is how much public funding went into creating those vaccines. So the government, and I don't want to talk nonsense, I don't remember the stats, maybe it was like up to 80% or some crazy number of government people's money that went into making this thing. And all of a sudden now they have the property rights, Pfizer and all this stuff, it's their vaccine. Like that's the part I find so crazy. Like, how come governments don't have any control if they're the ones putting in money? How come it's not subsidized or we get the vaccines for free? Like, I just found that so crazy.
And just to go back to your point where you mentioned how South Korea developed from kind of studying and taking this technology, and China, what Ha-Joon Chang says and why Kicking Away the Ladder is so, like, I think it's like a groundbreaking piece of work, is because he goes back and he shows you, wait, the Western nations also did this too. So the fact that they're turning around and they're calling China thieves and South Korea thieves or whatever, like, this was how they developed, and now they're essentially trying to gatekeep the method of growth.
Absolutely.
They're kind of demonizing these other countries for using the same techniques that they had. And it's,
I mean, you have to go back to the 19th century. America, highly protectionist economy, when it was trying to compete against England, essentially, at the time. And even England, where we have this idea of ourselves as always having been this free trade. No, I mean, you have to go back further. But, the way we got there was absolutely using these same tools. So I think it's absolutely groundbreaking as well. I agree. Yes, on your question, the AstraZeneca vaccine, it was invented by Oxford University, right? It's well known. Pfizer put a little bit more into theirs, but they still got huge amounts of public subsidy. I mean, you think Operation Warp Speed in the US, that's $17 billion just in one go, right? Just from one government. Right? And that's before you take into account what the European government spent. So Moderna, the Moderna vaccine, at the beginning of the pandemic, look at the work of Public Citizen in the US, and they looked at the figures and they said, this should be a people's vaccine because it's 100% funded by the American taxpayer. Now, and I actually think that played a role as well in the American administration's approach to this. So I think geopolitics, I think, is one thing. But I also think the Biden administration was absolutely furious with Moderna because they understood how this vaccine had been developed. And yet Moderna wouldn't even admit it. Right? So on the patents that it filed, the American scientists, the public scientists that had worked on this weren't even recognized. Right? They just wouldn't play ball at all. And that infuriated the administration. So absolutely, I think it was a moment at which, even people who are not normally on our side in these kind of arguments thought, wow, that's quite something, that you can really take that level of public research, of public know-how, you can privatize it, you can wall it off, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And I think you're right. I mean, it seems incredible that they don't, at the very least, you'd think, say you're not prepared to do this with state capacity. Say you, of course, you need to turn this research into something that can actually be produced and is safe and effective and needs to be trialed and so on. By the way, the NHS here does a lot of that work. But fine, say you need the private sector to come in and help you with that. Why on earth wouldn't you put conditions? Set terms on the basis for them doing that. I think it's astonishing that they don't, and I think it is. We've really got to look at what kind of state capture we've got